Hi everyone, this is USA expert Garv Khurana here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what I think is a pretty important concept in chess, which is that of a key moment in a chess game. So, according to my definition, a key moment in a chess game is the moment where you have to find a specific idea, a specific concept, where if you identify it, then you either hold or convert the position. And often this kind of moment will involve concrete thinking. It will be often kind of study-like or puzzle even. And it's your job to recognize when that moment arises in order to convert or draw the position. So I think this is something that a lot of people, including myself, have struggled with, which is that when you see a puzzle appear in a chess game, oftentimes it seems a lot easier in practice to just solve it as a puzzle, where if you weren't given that it was a puzzle, then you would often just struggle to actually solve the position, because you wouldn't know whether or not there's a tactic, and you kind of have to think that way for all the moves of a chess game. You can't be sure when it is that you're going to have a tactic and when it is that you just have to make positional decisions. So that's what I want to go over in this video, which is ways that you can try to better understand when it is that a concrete idea might arise in a game and when it is that you should stop and slow down and make sure that you are doing your due diligence to calculate out the game. And a lot of people, I think, refer to this as being some kind of intuition that strong chess players have and lower rated chess players often aren't able to understand. And while I think that's true to an extent, I think it's true in the sense that strong players often have more deliberate experience with specific structures, with specific concepts that allow them to connect the dots when they see similar patterns arise in their game. So that is to say that even if you can solve a puzzle, that even if the position that arises in your game you feel that you could solve as a puzzle under regular circumstances, it's actually important to be able to do a little bit more than that, namely to be able to understand the ideas that you need to an extent that even if you weren't given that it was a puzzle, that you would be able to just have those dots click in your head and immediately have the intuition that the idea actually is present and that there's something that you need to consider. So we're going to be going over some rapid games that I played on chess.com, and we're going to be talking about when the critical moment arises, and if I find the move, then we'll be talking about my thought process as to how I figured out that it was the moment to kind of stop and think. And if I didn't, then we'll talk about what it is that I might have overlooked and what takeaways there are from that mistake. So let's go ahead and get started. For the first game, we will start by taking a look at this game. I'm going to be just selecting kind of random games that I've played online so that it's more of a curated experience where I'm not just selecting the games where it's something that I might be trying to force a specific narrative. I kind of want to just make it something natural where you guys can just see that I'm not pulling this out of thin air, that it is something that will happen in your games, and kind of the ideas that go along with them also can be recognized in your games. Okay, so in this game, I have the white pieces, and we start off with a French defense. Apologies, I'm gonna mute this sound because I know that it can be a little bit loud, especially when I'm recording, so hopefully we don't have any issues with that. Alright, so we get a French defense, and of course this is all going to be opening theory, and my repertoire is that I typically play the A3 French, and against bishop d7 I honestly don't have something specific prepared. other than the fact that I can still play a3, I know that even though you allow this bishop trade, it's still supposed to be a relatively playable position for both sides, and I think white has a reasonable small edge here that is typical of an opening. And the reason that, of course, the reason that black wants to trade off these bishops is because this light squared bishop is often just hemmed in by these light squared pawns. So when they play bishop b5, then they can simply force this trade. But in doing it this way, what they often concede is that they allow immediate control in the center for white by taking these extra tempi in the opening to actually execute it. Okay, so my opponent played a5, and I had seen this idea before, and I do believe that I think one way of playing this is a4, where you somehow try to play like knight a3, knight 2, b5 maybe. So like, if you imagine, okay, probably not like, actually here's what maybe the best way of playing here would be for black. Maybe, probably taking on d4 seems reasonable, and then like, I think bishop b4 or queen to b4 check. Queen to b4 is probably not good, just because like you can just play, probably just play knight to c3 and you're defending the pawn. Queen's a little bit misplaced, but then bishop to b4 is also maybe not the best way, so I guess like knight a6 might be the preferred way. And maybe you don't even need to start with taking, though it's probably better just to avoid some specific situations. I'm not quite sure, actually. Yeah, this might be like a gambit kind of thing that you... Oh no, I guess you probably take on h6. No, wait. Oh wait, maybe you just take with the knight, and then you try to cement something on b5. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Actually, what I'll do is maybe pull up this game in analysis so that I can just check. Oh, I can make that. So yeah, I'll pull this up in analysis and we'll see. So, just so I don't take too much time trying to figure it out and derail the video. So, yeah, I guess like probably. So, I guess the point. So I guess after knight h6, you just play bishop to d3, which is kind of the move that I would probably play in a regular game. It just wasn't quite sure what the difference was here. Yeah, I guess just generally you want to have control of this. So you castle here. Okay, so that's the point. You do want to gambit this pawn, and just try to play for development. So maybe like knight a3 even, and then if you take, then you take, and you have this open b file, and you have good control of the b5 square. So just generally this is positionally pretty decent for white. And this is kind of a theme in the French where often you get these close structures where it's okay to give up some tempi and sacrifice pawns, or rather it's okay to give up some pawns in order to gain an initiative when you're opening up the position and the opponent has wasted some tempi. So yeah, we get bishop to d3 and we get this trade. And yeah, I didn't play in the most precise way. I should have played a4 here, or bishop to d3 is still fine here, I guess. Yeah, here I should have taken. I should have tried to misplace the queen a little bit. I think I know this now, but back then I was not quite aware that you're supposed to try and just play against the queen's position. Because something like this, you just get control to b5 square, and they can't really stay trying to control this diagonal, prevent you from castling, just because they don't really have the luxury to keep the queen in such danger. So yeah, I guess that would have been a better approach, but I end up castling, takes, queen to a6. Again, this is still the opening stage. Knight to c6. And yeah, we just had a solid French position where I didn't really get much of an opening advantage, though maybe h5 is a bit of an inaccuracy. Just because I don't think black really has the means to actually attack at the moment, because if they want to actually prosecute an attack, then they probably have to castle queenside, but at the moment that's quite dangerous because there's just so many weaknesses in the position. So I played b4, which was a pawn sacrifice, or rather it was a concrete idea that I had, where I was, it was a pawn sacrifice where I was hoping to get some initiative in exchange for the pawn, because I would be checking the king and just kind of paralyzing the black position. So I thought this was kind of a cool idea, and I did spend a bit of time here, but yeah, I wouldn't quite call this a key moment. I think there's a lot of moves, and b4 is not necessarily even the best one. I think probably a4 is even better, just trying to plot the knight into b5, like something like this, and knight b5, queen b6, and it's a relatively double-edged position, but I think white has some good play because the weaknesses in the position for black. I think you just get some standard development and play. Just playing very normal moves. And I think with this h5 push, there's some extra weaknesses that you can exploit as white. And note that in this position, the pawn, while it seems like it's hanging, there's also just queen h5, which is probably more dangerous for black than they want to allow. So like, you might take, sorry, no, you probably rook to rook h3 or rook g3, but I think rook g3 makes sense. And just having threats of like queen h6 in many cases. So that would kind of be how the game would proceed, I believe. But yeah, I played b4, and then we got into this position where I played knight to b5, and this was actually a mistake, just because I had to be a bit more concrete with the move knight to g5 and try to argue that this pawn was going to be very difficult to defend. I think the reason that I didn't go for this, I'm actually not sure why I didn't go for this. Maybe I thought like f6, and then I would have had to take and knight f7, and maybe I just thought that this wasn't all that impressive. But I guess here I have rook to d8 check, king to so king here, then there's rook to d6, and I guess you just pick up all these pawns at least, and also, yeah, you have knight b5, and there's just concrete mating ideas as well. So king b8 would have to be played, and then there would be, I think, bishop f4 check. The queen is, you just basically take the black king, completely destroy the defenses. So you get something like this, and this would be just completely winning. But yeah, I think I wasn't able to fully understand that in the game, and also apparently knight c8 was apparently a decent move here, and I don't think that was the reason that I rejected it, to be honest. So yeah, these games are from a few months ago, but I do believe that I remember some of the ideas, at least what I was considering. So yeah, here my opponent did play knight c8 after knight to b5. They actually had a very good position if they played their knight to g6, which isn't at all obvious to me why that's the case. I guess the question is, what is the nuance? So if I guess f6 is like this. Okay, so on knight c8, I guess I still have knight g5. What's the point? And if knight g6, knight g5, there's bishop b7. And now if I take on h8, then this pawn ends up being defended. So that, I guess, is the nuance, that if they were to play knight c8, then on knight g5, this bishop b7 doesn't really work, because I can just take on f7. And if they try to play something else, like knight to c6, then knight g5, bishop b7 doesn't actually work, because you can just take on h8, and the rook is not defended. So that's one of the other points of knight g6, just trying to defend the rook. So that would have been a very interesting way of playing. Kind of makes sense, just trying to unparalyze the black position by defending the rook. But I played, so after knight c8 though I played rook to b8, and then my opponent played king to c6, so they were trying to go after my knight, but I realized that this is actually too much of an issue for them, actually, because even though they're getting my knight back, their position's actually just a bit too paralyzed. And I think this was actually not a critical moment that was too difficult to understand, but I still spent some time, I believe, not quite yet. I think I recognized, I think I had seen this from here, so I thought that my opponent might play this because it's very natural, because this pawn is under attack, and if you play something else, apparently the best move was knight a6 and allowing with the point that there's this fork, but then I play rook f7 and they would take, and we would still get some interesting dynamics, but they had to probably find something like this in order to, they had to understand that this idea actually could work out for them, that they forked me, and that I wasn't fully threatening the b7 pawn. But I thought that maybe they might play king c6 as well, and I think this is what I calculated. So I saw that knight to b5 would be very strong. So one other thing you might be considering is bishop to g5, trying to go for something like bishop e7, but the problem with that is there's just knight c6 and the e7 square is covered. So knight to g5 was what I played, because I realized that now if they play f6, then I simply play knight e6 and this bishop is just falling. And otherwise I'm simply going to be hitting the rook, and then I can even go back, and whenever the rook is on a light square, then it can't actually get defended by the bishop, so I have time to keep the pin and collect more pawns and put more pressure on the bishop. So my opponent played knight to c6 here. I took, and I played bishop to g5. So here I didn't really quite identify the key moment, it seems. I spent a little bit of time, but I should have spent a little bit more, I would say, because I saw now, I guess, that knight to g5 was playable, but the problem in the game I likely thought was that knight to e7 is just hitting my rook, and it's defending my opponent's rook. But what I failed to quite understand was that I can just maintain this pin, and this bishop is actually just completely hemmed in. Even though the knight is defending the rook, the bishop can't actually get out, because if something like g6, then I just play knight takes e6, and the bishop is actually just not savable. If bishop to g7, then I can just take on g7. If bishop to a6, then I can just take on b7 with check, and I guess I'm not winning the bishop, but I am winning the knight. So that's what I should have taken some time to actually realize, that because what I should have recognized here was that the position is just so paralyzed for my opponent that there likely is a very concrete idea that I should spot, which would probably win the game for me. But I didn't end up spotting it in this case. Maybe because I thought that bishop to g5 was just clean enough that I was simply paralyzing the opponent still with bishop to e7, and it's still winning objectively, but it's still tricky for sure. So my opponent played king to c4, and yeah, they probably could have taken on d4, and then if I played bishop to e7, then even though I do get the rook, this endgame is actually not so clear because my opponent does have some real threats with this passer. So that was really the nuance that I didn't quite appreciate. So my opponent played king c4 though, and here I played knight to d6 check. And probably what I should have done was play bishop to e3 so that now I could maintain this paralysis, and if my opponent were to this knight is pinned, so my pawn would just be protected, and I could try to play for knight to g5, knight takes e6, not allowing the same counterplay. Probably b5. No, so b5 is not playable because the knight is singing, so really this would have just made my opponent have difficulties in actually finding a plan. But I didn't find that. I played knight to e6 check. My opponent took on e4, and I took on b7, and now maybe there's a bit less risk of the pawns becoming powerful because at least one of them's eliminated, and now my king can try to patrol them. But yeah, my opponent took on e5, and now I played this strong knight to d8. If I had played bishop to e7, which looks like it's strong, there's just knight to g6, which I think I'd seen in the game, where now if I take, then my opponent can just take, and I don't have any advantage. So I saw knight to e8, and now the point is that I'm simply winning this pawn, but also I'm creating the threat of winning the bishop, so my opponent has to play knight g6, and I still take, and now it's again equal pawns, but my opponent is still paralyzed, and here I have to be concrete, and this was probably so I'd spent some time here, and I think this is probably the second key moment of the game where I actually did find the important resource. So after king to e5, I believe that what I had spent some time on was understanding oh no, never mind, I did not find the move. So what I should have found, I guess, was rook to e8. This was the best move. And again, not super easy to understand, but I guess the point is if something like d4, then I can play knight takes g7, and I'm just knight takes g7 check. So the problem with knight takes f8 is that this knight actually still pins, so like my opponent can play king f5 and the knight is still falling, so it's not actually winning. I could play knight takes g7 check though, and my opponent actually can't hit any of my pieces. There's kind of this wall surrounding the black king, so when they move, then I can play rook to d8, and again there's this wall, so my opponent goes back, then I can play knight takes h5, and my opponent is still paralyzed, and I have threats like bishop h6, and if king f5, then I guess I can just play like h4, and really the main point is just that these pawns are all falling. I'm already up 2 pawns, and this pawn is gonna fall as well. So that would have been the cleanest way for me to win, but again, not easy to spot, and I had decided to play knight to c5. And yeah, this is probably still the second key moment of the game, where I should have I should have found this move, but or rather I should have spent some time trying to find this move, but again, it's kind of a hard thing to really decide in a game where there's actually not much time for either player at this point, so I do want to still be quick, but I think I should have spent more than 6 seconds to at least see if there was some idea that I was missing. So my opponent played king f5 here, and I played bishop to e3, and yeah, it's objectively an equal position at this point, but it's still tricky for my opponent just because they're the ones that are kind of paralyzed. And I played f4 check, which my opponent seemed to miss the point of, which and I didn't actually fully understand the point either, I guess. I'm actually a bit confused what it is that I missed here. Because maybe I thought that rook takes f8 doesn't work because rook f8, knight to e7 check, and king e4. Maybe I saw this line and realized that this is a winning endgame for black. But or maybe what I saw was that I could play knight to e7 check, and then there's king e4. But I guess what I missed here was just I have rook to e8 check, and now if king to e3, then I can just take on f4, and if bishop to c5 check, then this is actually a check. So the problem for my opponent is that they can only go to e3 or f5, and if they go to f5, then I can just take on f8. So the problem in the previous line was that if I were to take with the rook, then this basically transposes to that other variation. And if I were to take with the knight, maybe there's this idea of trying to sack the rook and going king takes. But yeah, here actually I can just play bishop takes f4. That's the main point. So yeah, we could have gotten like the point that I was trying to illustrate was that on bishop takes, on knight takes, this endgame could be a little bit tricky to win still. Maybe that's what I had seen, but I think if I'd seen that, I still probably would have gone for it, to be honest. But yeah, here I end up taking on f4, maybe because I thought that this was objectively winning after knight to e6 check. Maybe I thought that I was just winning a piece, but I guess actually it's not so obvious why this is not winning for white either. And yeah, it's definitely easier to analyze this with the engine on, and I'm probably not giving myself as much credit as I should for what I was seeing in the game, but yeah, I think I understand the point, which is that with king e3, rook f8, knight takes, this is actually difficult for white to play because this pawn is very quickly coming down the board. So king f1, d3, king to e1, d2 check, king to d1. Even though this looks like it should be winning for white because they have extra knight, this pawn is actually just a problem for white, and black can simply go king f2 and try to pick off the white pawns, I think. So that's the main problem. So going knight to g6, and this will just be a drop. But my opponent, and it seems like I didn't quite realize that nuance in the game. I think I just thought that bishop takes f4 check was just a winning move, and my opponent should have punished me for it. They spent some time, but they didn't, I guess, realize that this endgame would have been okay for them. And I guess that's maybe key moment 3, but for my opponent instead, they needed to find that they could just play king takes f4. Yeah, I ended up playing knight to d7, and I guess I wanted to go into this endgame with bishop c5 check, but I could have also just played bishop to d6, and I don't really know why it didn't play this, because, or I don't actually know what. Yeah, maybe I thought that bishop d6 and I would have had to go for this. Maybe that's what I thought, but I could simply just take on d6. Like, I am up a piece at the moment, so maybe I thought bishop b3 and bishop takes, and then there would have been something like this. Maybe that's what I thought, but I didn't. Yeah, bishop d6 I should have found, but again, lower time, so I think I probably saw bishop c5 check and just wanted to go for some game, but I don't quite remember, to be perfectly honest. Though I probably just blundered this, to be honest. I would be surprised if I had intentionally wanted to go for this position, because this is not very clear cut for either side. When you have a pure rook versus two minor pieces, it's generally considered a pretty decent imbalance, even though like two minor pieces is considered better than the rook. When it's just a pure rook versus two minor pieces, the rook can move so far across the board that the minor pieces can often have trouble coordinating well against it. And that's why there's kind of this common adage where if you have two pieces, or rather if you're down a rook for two pieces, you typically want to trade off one pair of rooks. And if you have two pieces for a rook, then you typically want to keep rooks on the board, because you have the ability to keep patrolling all sides of the board, whereas with these two pieces, they're kind of a bit constrained just because of the squares they can't really go to, for example, a8 like the rook can, but also black does also have a pawn, so that's really what compensates the material imbalance, or rather the material advantage that white has in terms of the pure piece play. So yeah, my opponent played rook 8, and I have a feeling that this game ended up just being okay, I was thinking it might be a game where I won on time, given that I'd seen the result where I did end up winning, but it seems that my opponent ended up blundering a pawn here. Then after pawn to d3 check, knight to g3, I created some practical problems for my opponent, because they had to make sure that they're always holding onto this e-pawn, and I just did have the two pieces for the rook, so my opponent played rook to c2, and they're down to 46 seconds, and now it's really just a time scramble, I would say. And I guess my opponent here missed that I can play knight to d6 check, and they don't actually have the ability to maintain control of the pawn, and if they try to go for, say, king to e4, or king to d5, they have... Okay, well, I thought that I found this in the game. It's always interesting looking back at these games where you feel like where you think that you would have found the best moves, and you see them. But I thought that I must have played king takes d3, because rook to b3 check, king to c2, and the rook is hit, and I can rescue my knight, and my opponent can't actually get to my pawns. And the main point is that if they take, then I can simply skewer the rook. So I thought that I probably would have played that, but I guess I didn't spot that in the game. Yeah, I guess I played knight to f5, maybe trying to avoid some of the risk, which also makes some sense with the time situation, but yeah, I guess here we ended up just getting this position where I ended up giving a piece, but these two pawns are simply too strong, and I ended up winning the rook and checkmating promptly. So yeah, that was an interesting game. Maybe not the most instructive for the point I'm trying to illustrate. So we can go ahead and take a look at another. I think that it was still definitely an interesting one to look at, where there were still quite a few key moments, just unfortunately not really solved by either player for the most part. Okay, so we'll take a look at this game next, and I will make sure to do one of my losses as well. So I think we'll do one more game after this, and I'll make it be one of my losses. So yeah, we can take a look at this one. We have pawn to e4, d6, and we get this Pirc defense, where yeah, I typically play bishop c4, at least in shorter time controls. I think maybe in longer time controls, I consider playing bishop d3 against it, which is maybe a bit of a more solid setup. But bishop c4 is what I typically play, kind of mirroring an Italian kind of setup. I like to have this bishop on c4 just because it gives its pressure on f7 always. Although with e6 it doesn't, but e6 is a small concession in and of itself because it doesn't take as much space. And yeah, my opponent played bishop to g7, and we just got some regular development. Yeah, I think I remember this game, so I think this one was a pretty instructive one to take a look at. So yeah, here I ended up playing pawn to e5. Also, I will just go to separate analysis tabs so we can all see the objective evaluation. And yeah, here actually, I do believe that I had some problems in the opening. I wasn't quite understanding what was going on as well as I should, and my opponent could have punished me for that a bit more concretely by playing knight takes g3, h takes, and just taking on e5. I think my opponent probably saw this position, but they could have simply gone queen e7, and next move taken on f3 and just won my pawn. So I would have had some trouble actually defending the position if they had done that. And yeah, this is definitely not desirable. And I think I'd seen this during the game, but my opponent did not quite spot it. So yeah, my opponent ended up playing queen e7, and I played move h3, provoking them to take on f3, in which case they would win this pawn, but then I could just take this knight at least. So that was kind of the point, that I was tactically defending the pawn with h3, but my opponent played knight to f4, which is the best move, and then now they took on f3, and now they took on e5, but what they should have done was not take on e5, because my pawn is just eternally weak. That's, I guess, the main thing my opponent had missed, and they'd spent some time throughout the game. I think they spent about a minute here. This is maybe you could argue a key moment where they should have recognized that this pawn is just an eternal weakness. We could flip the board and kind of understand that knight takes g3, and even though you don't end up winning the pawn immediately after one move, the pawn is just too weakened. So definitely a mistake by my opponent, but an understandable one given that it's not like an immediate material gain. It's kind of sometimes more difficult to see the deeper ideas like these ones. And my opponent did play bishop f3 here, but after taking, they decided to go for this position where I am a little bit worse, but I'm not down any material at least. And I decided to play queen to e4, and I played g3. And yeah, here I spent some time playing queen e4, and maybe I shouldn't have spent as much time as I did, but I think it was probably a good practical decision. I wouldn't quite call it a key moment, but I think that this was a very decent choice because I'd seen queen takes c3, and what I intended on doing was this move pawn to g3. And my point was that on knight takes h3 check, I would be able to play king to g2, and now this knight would be actually in some trouble. My opponent would have had to play g4, and I had seen this position where I would be doing pretty decently, where this knight is now the only thing that's defending the king, and after removing my bishop, I could have some ideas of just playing against the king, which regardless is better than the position at this point. And I think that's also a good lesson to just note that you don't have to make sure that the position is necessarily going to be good for you if the position is already one that the position that you calculated in a line is going to be good for you. You don't have to make sure of that if the position that you're starting out with is already not ideal. You just have to make sure that it's better than the position that you're starting out with. So that sometimes reduces the calculation load that you have to do. And yeah, here my opponent ended up playing knight to g6, and they'd missed this move, bishop takes e6, and I believe I spent a few seconds here, and I would argue this is a key moment because I'm winning a pawn now, and I had to make sure that I wasn't blundering something like rook to e8, but here I would have queen takes g6 check. So yeah, I think I didn't spot this immediately, but I did spot it after a few seconds. And if my opponent were to take, then I would just have winning position, just because I'm picking up all the pawns. So this was an important moment to just pause and think about the fact that my opponent didn't go for the line that I was expecting them to, so I should take a few seconds to just process the position and see what has changed. And I think that's what allowed me to ensure that I was going to be able to find this move, because it isn't really a tactic that arises in most of these lines, but with the knight on g6, it's a concrete one. And I think it's also a pattern recognition where I see that my opponent is kind of a little bit weak on the light squares just in general, because I have all these light squared pieces, or at least like this light square control, and because of that, that's why I'm kind of thinking about these tactics on the light squares, because my opponent is a little bit overpressed, and they have to make sure that they're controlling everything when their position is a little bit tough on that square complex. So really, this pawn on f7 is overloaded because of that. So yeah, my opponent played knight g6, and we ended up going into this position, and I played queen to b7. My opponent played queen to b6, and we got rook to b5, queen to f3, bishop to b3, and yeah, here I think is a pretty interesting moment where I was setting up this idea of f4 by playing king to g2. If I had played f4 immediately, it would have been playable, I guess, but I think probably I didn't like the look of knight to g6, and if takes, then queen takes g5, and my position's still a little bit weakened, so I have to be careful. Probably that's what I didn't want to go for, but I'm not 100% sure either. I think I might have also just wanted to ensure that this f3 square is overprotected, so no harm in doing that, really. I ended up playing f4 here, though actually I could have played rook f2 e1, which I don't think is a really intuitive move, because you're kind of provoking knight f3, but the point is that you have rook to e3, and now takes, queen takes, the knight has to come back and then get rook to d5, and actually this knight is causing some trouble, and the position actually just becomes very passive for my opponent. So kind of a positional reason that that move is not really good, and it's not really an easy one to understand, but yeah, my opponent ended up getting quite low on time at this point, so they played queen to c6 after f4, but they just missed that after bishop to d5, which I think this is a key moment, because you have to make sure that after rook takes c2 check, you are not actually in any trouble, which I spent about 30 seconds making sure that I would not be in any trouble. And why is it important to spend time here? I think it's very important to spend time here just because if you do make a miscalculation, then the weight of that is just so much greater because you have a winning position at this point. You know that if you're accurate with the time situation and with the names of the position, you know that if you're accurate, then you will be able to win the position. But you have to make sure that you're not missing any resources. If you miss a resource, then the game simply turns completely the other way, and you will often just lose the game. So even though I see the move bishop to d5, and I see, oh, I'm hitting the queen, I'm hitting this knight, I should be winning piece, it's important to do your due diligence and make sure that you're not overlooking something for your opponent that could potentially win them the game. Because you don't have to go for the move that looks like it'll win if there's some danger that in going for it that you haven't properly assessed. So yeah, I did spend some time here though. I spent about 30 seconds just making sure that after rook takes c2 check, I can simply play king h1. And it's important to play king h1 because if you play king to g1, then there's actually queen to c3. That's kind of the point that I was making here, where you have to be very careful because you have weaknesses in this position. So just making sure that you are actually safe after this move is the key thing. And I did calculate that after king h1, queen to c3, I can simply take, and after takes, I have this important move, at least. So, okay, the point really just being that after queen takes, I can simply take this at the very least. And then there's no perpetual because my bishop can come back and defend. So that was what I had to make sure that I had seen in order to go for this position. And also, if queen to b2, then I have queen to g6 check, king take h8 takes, takes, and also just one thing to notice that this is actually just never a threat. So not only am I just creating mating threats against my opponent's king with something like rook to f4, I believe should be win. So not only am I creating mating threats, my opponent doesn't actually have any threats against me. So queen f2 and queen g2 are never possible. Yeah, that's just kind of the key thing to recognize, that as long as you're accurate, especially when you're in a winning position, you should try to be as precise as possible. And it's one thing for me to say it, but I guess it's another thing to actually implement that in games, where you just have to really be thinking about the evaluation of the position consciously whenever you can. And when you feel that your position has very high chances of being winning, that is when you should stop and make sure that you are being accurate, because it's simply a matter of are you doing what you need to do to actually pull out the win. So yeah, my opponent ended up playing king to g7 here, trying to prevent queen to g6 check, and I played queen to f5, trying to reinforce some threats. Again, if my opponent plays queen takes g3, then I can just take the rook. So now I played bishop to e4, and I simply checkmated my opponent. So yeah, again, not too big of a critical moment in this game, but still definitely an important one, where I think that recognizing that I'm just winning the pawn was really the recognizing at this point that I'm winning the pawn was probably the most important thing, where I had to reevaluate the position when I saw that there was a noticeable change in my perception of what was happening. So yeah, and then I guess bishop to d5 was also a pretty important moment as well. Yeah, I think that was an interesting game to analyze. I think I will actually do 2 more, just because I don't think that these were the most instructive games that I had played in this batch. So I will do 1 more win and then 1 more loss, or rather 1 loss, because I haven't covered a loss yet. So I think we can take a look at this game. And yeah, so here, let me just turn this up and take our tab. Okay, so thought that it muted. Okay, there we go. So yeah, in this game, we did get an Italian. This is my main opening. So I think that the Italian game is one where the critical moments actually are more pronounced. So hopefully this one will be a good one to analyze and just highlight some key things. So yeah, here we get d3 and a4, and we get these regular moves in the Italian. This is one thing that I advocate for, which is that you should start with h3 typically, so that typically your opponents will respond with h6, because it's generally a move that you want to play where you prevent knight to g5 step in the future. And queen b3 combined with that can be sometimes dangerous, so your opponents will typically play h6, and it's objectively one of the top moves. But you actually have a pretty easy plan of playing against it, where you can play bishop to e3, play knight to d2, and just play for the center. And yeah, I guess what I meant to say was, if your opponent plays normally, typically they don't play queen e7. Typically they'll castle or play bishop takes e3. Then what you'll do is castle, play knight d2, and if they play bishop a7, then you can take it and play for d4. And otherwise, you just end up playing a regular position if they take on e3. And you can play queen b3. You have ideas of taking on c5 at many points just to damage structure. Though that's not the main idea, because it can allow the opponent to get some clamp on the d4 square. But all that aside, we do end up getting a similar variation, but the thing is my opponent played queen to e7. And that's not really a typical move in the Italian. I think the more typical placement of the queen is actually, let me just see it from this perspective. So yeah, I think the thing with this is that they kind of missed the point, or they didn't really quite understand the main idea of the Italian and the main way that you create counterplay, which is that you often want to go for this d5 break, not necessarily by itself, but sometimes with c6 and d5. That's often the way that you try to play against white setup, and that's why you also want to have the queen on d8, because it helps support such a push. But my opponent decided to play queen e7, and now what they're doing is they just give me a free roll at the center if I'd like it, and also they don't have the same ability to play for d5, so kind of just, I think, a small lack of understanding by my opponent about the opening. And I played knight to d2, and really after bishop to e6, my opponent immediately blundered. They had to play either bishop takes e3, in which case they allow me to win a pawn, or they had to take with the f-pawn, in which case I would be able to play bishop c5 and queen b3 and just get a very pleasant position, and likely be able to win this pawn as well. If they play rook to b8, then I can play queen to b5, and there's just quite a few weaknesses with like knight to b3 coming, and if they castle here, then I can just castle. The position is really difficult to defend, because I just had this idea of playing rook to d1, knight to c4, and knight takes e5. My opponent does have some compensation with the open f-file, but I don't think it's really quite enough. I think maybe knight c5 here is not quite what you want to do, because you allow this extreme sacrifice, which can be very dangerous. That's something to always look out for in the Italian. But I think just knight to h2 and playing for maybe maybe something with knight to g4, knight to c4, maybe just knight to c4 after this, just with the knight on h2, because now the king is safe because rook f3 doesn't exist, and then you can just try to take on a5. So probably that's the main idea. But anyways, my opponent decided not to go for this, and they took with the queen, simply missing the somewhat basic tactic. And I guess we were kind of blitzing through the opening, which is maybe why this happened, where I'm simply ending up with an extra piece. It's that classic forking tactic. And I'm assuming the rest of the game was... no, it wasn't clean, actually. I remember this game. I ended up blundering a piece, but so I ended up blundering the piece back because I missed that they had this pin. And this is kind of being a little bit sloppy on my part, where I had an extra piece, and I should have done my own due diligence of just making sure that I'm not allowing any counterplay. I think what I missed with knight to e4 is I thought that I'm being active, but I just didn't quite look at all my opponent's resources for counterplay, and queen to g6 is simply winning the piece back. So I ended up going for this position, but it was objectively losing if my opponent found this move f5, which I think I had seen during the game, where if knight takes g5, then I'm simply losing the bishop. So it's just a pin. But my opponent played queen to e6 a bit too quickly, so maybe allowing me some counterplay. Yeah, here he ended up playing f5, and he was still completely winning. I ended up playing queen to c4, just hoping for some counterplay. And I'm not actually sure how I won this game. I think what we'll do is we'll take a look at another game after this one, just because this one I don't think is a really high quality game to begin with. But yeah, my opponent played bishop to d6 check at this point, and I was just very low on time. I think my opponent was playing very quickly, and I was taking some time. So what I should have found here was that I actually have this very nice tactic with rook takes d6 and queen f7, and now I'm simply threatening ideas of mating the black king. And there's actually not really a way to stop it if they don't simply give up material. So my opponent would have had to play queen to e5 check, and this would have been a draw in all likelihood, but at least objectively, but probably my opponent could still try to play for a win because of the time situation. And like, I can take on b7, but I don't think this position is super easy to defend still, because this e-pawn is a strong passer. But if we get something like this, then it should just be a draw, where I get all these checks. And yeah, the main thing is just to not not defend with something like queen d2, because what happens is the queen just becomes very passive, and even if so, like, you really need to try to get these checks in order to defend the position. Because like if you give something like rook d4 and now the checks are prevented, then ideas of rook to e8, rook to d2 come in, and the pawn can easily become a very strong threat. Yeah, my opponent, or rather I missed rook to d6, I played rook to f4, and I think I still had enough time here to actually find the correct move. I should have found rook takes d6, but yeah, my opponent ended up playing queen to e4. They probably thought this was a very flashy move, but yeah, I guess even though this game was maybe not the most instructive in terms of the overall quality, I think that this is a very nice moment to recognize where I have 2 minutes and 20 seconds, and it's easy to just autopilot and assume this game is lost. But I actually have a win here. And I think that being in the losing position actually helps me in this case, because I'm in such a terrible position that the time is not really important. I just need to find anything concrete if I can. So if I shouldn't even like bother trading points. I shouldn't even bother considering this, because it's just dead loss, because I'm losing this rook, and any trades like this will never be able to bear anything for me. But just by taking a second to think about the position, I realized that my opponent blundered rook h5 check, and I spent 20 seconds, and even though I probably could have found it in less, it was the right moment to spend that time, because simply black king only has one move, king to g6, and queen f7 ends up being a mate. So yeah, that was not really I don't think that was a very helpful game for the analysis, just because I think it wasn't really all about the chess. It was a lot about the speed of the game. So we'll take a look at one more of my wins, and then we'll take a look at one of my losses. So here we go. This game, I also had white. Interesting that it seems like most of my games I had white. But yeah, we'll just hit the tab, and okay, there it goes. So here we end up getting a Sicilian, and my opponent played knight to f6, and we got this 4 knights position, where I could have played this move e5, but I wasn't quite well versed in theory here, so I decided to transpose to a classical Sicilian, which I think it's a pretty like flexible opening for white. You have many steps. I like to play with bishop to g5 very often, but though here it's still possible for black to try and use the Sveshnikov with something like this. So this is a position that I play into myself as black, and one of the main lines is taking on c6 and playing e5, and you get this kind of theory where f4 and queen e6, and this is a very common way of playing. But yeah, I guess if my opponent had ended up going into that, then I would have had to figure out something different. Also, I guess e5 is immediately leading to the Sveshnikov, which isn't really in my repertoire. So what I've actually learned now is how to play for this e5 position, and going into kind of a Scandinavian type structure. If they take on c3 and playing for d4, or rather, if they take on c3, then I can take with the d pawn, and if it is 6 here, then bishop to c4, and you cannot take because bishop takes f7 actually wants a queen. So this is one of the main lines of the Nimzo variation of the Sicilian. But yeah, I ended up going into this position where my opponent decided to play for d5, and we got a bit of a different kind of position. Maybe resembles an Alpin a bit, but I played c4, and in retrospect, this is just not a good move, because I'm simply abandoning this pawn. I should have played c3, I think, or taken on c5. Taking on c5 is maybe not the easiest thing to do, just because even though you get this pawn, sometimes you can allow ideas of forking, but in this case, the reason this is not quite as dangerous as many other positions where you trade queens and go into an endgame is because there's no second knight for black to use to try and create a fork on c2. So one of the dangers would be if there was a knight on f6 and they played knight to g4, and then you have to play king to e1, but then there's knight to b4, and you have to defend both forks, and it's the principle of two weaknesses at play where you can't really do it with one move. So that's why maybe that would have been playable. But also, I guess bishop to e3 is just a very solid move, making sure that the pawn isn't going to lead to material loss. But I ended up playing c4, and even though I ended up getting this position, my opponent could have played pawn to e5. And it's not so obvious why this is actually bad, but I think that the main problem is that this c-pawn is quite weak, and if I play something like rook to c1, which probably is the most natural way of playing, then f5 comes, and I'm just not really well positioned in the center, while my opponent has two pawns that are taking up some very key space. So that would have been the main problem. My opponent decided to just take on d4 twice, and this is not quite as scary, but it still has some dynamics. So my opponent played for e5, I played bishop to c4, and we ended up getting this position where I pushed my pawn to c6, and I played bishop to b5. And yeah, so here I decided to play for this move pawn to g4 because my opponent had pushed the pawn all the way to h3. And this is kind of a closed type of structure. But yeah, here was, I think, the main critical moment of the game, where my opponent played bishop to b3, and it's, again, not obvious why this is so bad for my opponent. And I did spend a few seconds here. I didn't spend so much time, and that's the reason that I didn't actually find the move. I played rook takes d8, simply thinking that that was the best move, but I missed that I can just play this move rook to d7 check. Rook takes d7, c takes d7, and now on king to b8, bishop to a6, this c8s were simply a problem for my opponent. And they can play bishop to e6. If they play bishop to c5, then I can just take, and it's just a better version of the previous position. But on bishop to e6, the problem is that I can still play rook to c8 check, rook takes c8, and I can play bishop takes c8. Now my opponent can play king to c7, or they can play bishop to c7, but let's say king to c7. Then I have this move d8 queen, which is important because now I actually pick up their bishop. And if they play bishop to d7, it's the same thing. I force them to take my queen, and then I win their bishop. So kind of a nice tactic there, but not one that I spotted, unfortunately. So my opponent ended up having a fine position, and I was in some trouble because these pawns are really just weak for me. But after rook to c3, they took on, I took on d3, and after they took on b2, they took on b2. I didn't take on b3. I didn't take on d3. I'm messing up the squares a little bit, but we had bishop to e6, and I took on h3 now. And again, even though this position is lost, it's not maybe the most obvious position to understand. And the reason it's lost is because they have rook to b3, forcing a trade of rooks, really, because otherwise I'd be losing this pawn. The engine says to play for rook d1 and allow rook takes f3, but I think practically this is probably the way that you would have to go. I think it's the most important line, and the thing is that this bishop is really just constrained to defending his pawn, and that causes a problem because bishop to d5 simply ends up picking up this pawn, and black ends up with a pawn up in a pawn endgame. So we ended up getting this position. My opponent played rook to b4, and they didn't find rook to b3. So after king to f4, we got bishop takes c6, and I played rook to c3, trying to create some pins against my opponent, but rook c6, king a6, and rook to d3. This is just a losing position for me, but I still had chances for counterplay because I could potentially play for h4 and pushing my pawn. And here my opponent played rook to a5, and I spent 30 seconds here and found the key move, which requires some concrete calculation. And that move is rook to f5. And what is the point of rook f5? So if my opponent plays rook takes, then g takes, and my opponent is simply losing the game because my pawn promotes first by 1 tempo. Or rather, by 2 tempi technically, but I can't allow my opponent to promote, because then it would be probably winning for them. Maybe it wouldn't be, but it would at least be a draw. So, effectively by 1 tempo. And with rook f5, I'm also threatening to potentially trade the rooks. So if my opponent moves their king, then I can actually take, and I can play h4. I didn't technically have to see this, just because I think I probably would have had to see it. But the reason that I'm mentioning that I maybe didn't have to necessarily spot this was because this position is even with the rook to f7 check, or even with I think even with the rook f7 check, this position is maybe it probably has the same stasis as the position here if there isn't rook f4. It's effectively the same kind of position, so it's not like I'm really risking much in terms of worsening the position. But so I probably didn't end up calculating that variation, but I think I just generally understood that I should be able to have some sort of pawn in game where it's double-edged at least. So after something like this, then we would get this pawn race, and even though my opponent promotes first, it's not enough to actually win the game. So I would have had queen to f7 check, and I think I pick up the pawn. If king to b6, then I can play queen e6 check, and eventually they are going to, if they go up, then I have queen e7 check, and if they go here, then I can check and win the pawn. If they go here, then again I can, I think, check. And just generally, there's so many checks available in the position that it should just be a draw. But I'm probably picking up the pawn in most lines as well. So that would have been the key thing to see. And also important to note is that on h4, a4, there's only one move, which is h takes g5. You have to play this because otherwise the pawns would have promoted on the same files, or on the same diagonal, and because black promotes first, black would have been able to capture the white queen. So yeah, I did end up finding the move, so that was an important critical moment to recognize. And the third key point here is that if my opponent moves the rook, then I'm always threatening to take on g5 and equalize the material. And ultimately, my opponent, I think, recognized that this pawn endgame was not good for them, so they gave me a check, but they had to give up their pawn and try to create some counterplay, or rather create some play with the pawns that they had by trying to push them quickly down the board. And here, maybe they could have created some very difficult problems for me if they played king to b7. Now, I don't have an easy way to actually try and prevent the pawn from queening. And if we get something like this, MB3, I could play rook to F1, which I guess is considered the best move. My opponent has this move A5, and these positions are always very difficult to calculate just because there's so many possibilities for both sides to play, but it's not necessarily important to calculate everything, just to understand the general dynamics, which are that black already has their pawns a little bit further up the board, and when the goal is promotion, that is the most important thing. So black, for that reason, has winning position. So here, something like rook to e2, and if g6, then rook to e6 is the key move, where this pawn is actually just falling. And the problem for white is that this setup is just not really breakable, because you can never just pick up the pawns by yourself as the white rook. And once these pawns get somewhere here, then it's just e2 and game over. Well, a2 after you move the king. But yeah, this is not what happened in the game though, and I ended up going to d1 here and played rook b1. Ultimately, we got a similar type of race, where I think here it's just about trying to play good moves under the time constraints, and my opponent played rook to b4, which was actually a mistake, which I spotted, and I took some time here to make sure of it. I spent 18 seconds because I think I was pretty confident that rook to b4 was not going to be the best move, and that there might be a winning tactic for me, or there might be a clean equalizing tactic for me. And the reason that I recognized that was because at the moment this is all about a race for who's promoting first, and with a move like rook to b4, it's really kind of a nothing move, because yes, I can play something like king h3, and yes, they are threatening my pawn, but the thing is that they're not addressing the bigger threat, which is the h-pawn. The h-pawn is the one that is almost already queened. It's 2 squares away from promotion. So this kind of move is just a bit too passive to feel like it's going to be the absolute best move. And for that reason, I spotted this tactic with a7, where if my opponent takes on g4, which is what they did, then I can simply play king to h3. And now I'm hitting the rook, and I'm also threatening promotion, and they don't have a square on g8 to actually defend promotion from. And importantly, they cannot get behind me in order to prevent the promotion by a skewer, because my pawn, or rather the squares, are simply protected. So the h2, h1 squares, they don't actually have access to. And also, they can't get even where they would be able to check on h1 or h2. So my opponent played rook to c4, and now I just queen, and they played rook c3 check, and ended up resigning after this. So yeah, that was an interesting game as well. I think maybe the main key moments were probably around here, where I should have found this move rook to d7 check, but I didn't quite spend enough time in processing that something like that might exist. Which I would hope to... I'd like to say that I find it now, but again, the play speaks for itself, and I ended up not finding it. So it's definitely one of those things where it's easy to overlook just because you don't see this check existing for so long in the position, because the bishop, the light square bishop, is always covering it, and I think I just kind of blanked on the fact that the bishop had moved, so the situation changed. And that's really, I think, the main thing to recognize, is that you should spend time on noticing if it's a key moment, or rather on considering that a move might be a key moment if the position has changed significantly, or if just the general dynamics of the position have simply been altered in some fundamental way. So I think that's a pretty important takeaway, and we can go ahead and move on to the last game. Which I think we'll take a look at this game, which I did end up losing. So I have the black pieces in this one. Hopefully that's a nice change of pace. And go to the analysis. So yeah, here we have d4, and we get this exchange variation. So not the more aggressive setups with knight c3 or the Catalan, just a bit of a more quiet system. And an important thing to note is that the exchange variation is considered dangerous for black if the white knight hasn't committed itself to f3 yet, typically. That's kind of the meta. And with something like this, and pawn to d4, and pawn to d5, this is considered a little bit more of an optimal setup for white, because they can play for say bishop to g5, you can play bishop e7, e3, castles, bishop to d3, say knight, or say c6, and then knight to e2 is considered the more important, rather the more pertinent way of playing. The thing with knight f3, which the engine does say is good here, I guess because maybe concretely the e5 square in this variation is a little bit weaker. But yeah, like yeah, so maybe rook e8 is kind of the main line. I don't really play this exchange variation as much myself, but yeah, this is kind of the main point, where if you play knight to f3 here, then maybe there's some h6, bishop to h4, and then c6 now, and playing knight to e5 here isn't quite good, because you play knight to bd7, and taking on e5 is actually perfectly fine, because you get this situation. Whereas if knight, or if c6 is played here, then now knight f3, and if rook to e8, then you can try to play for queen c2 instead, where this is a better way of playing, because you just play for control over the e5 square. But yeah, it's kind of the meta to just play for knight to e2 instead, for the main reason that you can play for f3, e4, and just try to take the center. And that's not something that's allowed if you have the knight on f3, because you can't push the f-pawn. This is also kind of a common idea in the same-ish variation of the Nimzo Indian. So we end up getting this less precise variation of the exchange, which isn't to say that it's bad, just to say that it's not the most theoretically reputable one. And I ended up playing pawn to b5 here. And pawn to b5 was probably a bit early on my part. It wasn't maybe the most accurate. I think probably g6 or something could have been a little bit more apt. Maybe trying to play for knight f8 and knight to e6, or maybe not knight e6, but just kind of having this defensive setup where I'm a little bit more flexible. But with pawn to b5, I'm saying that I'm going to try to place a knight on c4 and create some compensation that way. This is a common idea in these Carlsbad structures, where you have these pawns situated with a 5 on 4. So also a common idea in the Caro-Kann. Exchange Caro-Kann, rather. And we get castles, knight to b6, and the problem with my setup here is that I'm tactically not quite prepared, because after a4, I cannot really play a6, because there's a takes, and there's knight takes b5, which is an unfortunate thing where here I'm actually allowing bishop to c7, and my pieces get forked. So I did see that in the game that I couldn't play a6, which is why I spent some time here, because I thought that it was playable, but I realized that I made a mistake. So probably after b4 castles, I should have played for bishop to b7 first, so that maybe rook to c8 could be played if the knight moves, or on a4 I can actually play a6 or b4 still. A lot of the time you don't want to allow a5 just because it prevents the knight from being able to go to c4 square anymore. So sometimes you do want to just play b4 to play for tempo when you move. And yeah, here we got a4. I played b4, and we did get a similar setup, but one where this a pawn is kind of eternally weak, and I decided to try and play for a bit of a more tactical approach, where I played knight to c4, with the idea that if they take, I can skewer the queen and the rook. Now, it's still not necessarily the worst position for white, just because they do get 2 pawns for the piece, for the exchange rather, but it's definitely preferable to what I had. My opponent ended up playing knight to d2, knight f to d2, and probably they should have played for knight to e5, looking to punish my idea a little bit, where now my knight basically has to move, or I have to give a pawn. So something like this. And maybe I can damage structure, but this is just not a great position for me anyways. There's not much better I can do, because if I take, then this is just allowing very big problems in the position. I guess f3 is probably the most accurate move here, though you could take, but you maybe allow some stuff with queen e6 and give them counterplay with the bishop pair. So we end up getting knight f to d2, we get a trade, bishop a6, h6, and my opponent ends up getting a very strong clamp in the center, or rather in the c file, and the position kind of plays itself from here for my opponent. I play queen to d7, hoping that if they take on a5, then I would be able to play bishop to b6, and that was kind of the trick that I was going for. But my opponent didn't fall for it. They played queen to c2. They spent some time here, which I think is a wise decision by them, because, I mean, personally, if I was playing in this position, I would definitely be considering knight takes a5, and bishop to b6 is not necessarily the most obvious resource, so kudos to my opponent for that play. But yeah, my opponent ended up playing queen c2, so yeah, I'd probably call that a key moment as well. And here my opponent played knight takes a5, and I think that's probably what they were trying to understand the nuance of, which is that now on bishop to b6, I did play this, but the problem is that I can't really take this knight anymore because my rook is hanging. And the difference in the other line is that if they take, bishop takes, rook takes, my rook is not hanging because my queen is still protecting it. And by forcing my rook and my queen are both attacking it. And by forcing my rook to e6, by putting additional pressure on the pawn, they relinquished one defender while adding an attacker. So very nice play by my opponent there. And yeah, I ended up trading and playing king to h8, but the writing was kind of already on the wall. So a few more moves, and my opponent offered a queen trade. I declined, just hoping maybe create some back rank counterplay. But yeah, here my opponent played knight to f5 check. Again, a very strong move. At this point, yeah, I had spent some time just trying to see if maybe there was any hope left in the position, but my opponent simplified it pretty cleanly into a pawn game where they were simply promoting, and I ended up losing on time in this position. So yeah, again, I think that probably the key moments would be more accurately converted in a classical game. Just in all of these games in general, I think my opponent did pretty well here. But yeah, even like at this 2500 level, you can see that it's not necessarily the most accurate chess that's always played, when the time constraints make playing good moves difficult. So yeah, I'd say that the key moments would be likely at this point, where I think even though I did allow a4, it was good of me to recognize that I did make a mistake and not continue with my own idea of playing a6 and allowing this tactic, which would have been likely devastating for me. One thing to note is that if I take on a1, then I still end up getting forked, so the exchange of rooks doesn't really change that. And also, good play here by my opponent. I don't know if I would necessarily classify it as a key moment, but because it's kind of more of an obvious move, but you could definitely argue that it is a key moment. And my opponent spent a few seconds here and probably recognized that positionally, at the very least, this is a very vulnerable structure for me. And probably they did see knight takes b5 as well on a6. So I would say those first two were probably constituted about one key moment. And then here, I think my opponent, he did miss this move bishop to f5, which I think I did see in the game, and I was concerned about. They played bishop takes e6 quite quickly, so probably I count that as a key moment, but not maybe the most important one. And here I would say was the third key moment, which my opponent was on the side of where they recognized that knight takes a5 was not playable at the moment because of bishop to b6. So they found a very nice nuance, which allowed them to actually execute the same idea. So yeah, overall pretty good game by my opponent, and kudos to them. Yeah, hopefully you found these games relatively instructive. I guess just some general takeaways overall. Make sure that when the position has changed, and I guess I'll actually go back to the game for 1 second, because I think that the bishop f5 move was maybe a good example of this. Apologies. The bishop f5 move, I think, was a pretty good example of this, where the situation had changed a little bit, because I'd always had this move, rook to a8 available. So here my opponent could play bishop f5, which it's not a bad move, but it's perfectly playable, but maybe it's not like the exact moment that you're always looking to play it at. And after bishop to a6, my opponent didn't quite realize the difference here, that after bishop to f5, me moving the rook, this pawn would hang, whereas my bishop was always on b7 before. So I think that's kind of an important theme to highlight, that in general, when the position is undergoing a change, that's kind of the most important point to be aware that there might be a key moment coming up, or even on that current move that you're on, it could arise. So also here, just to kind of revisit some of the other games. In the first one, we had this French defense where the position had a lot of nuances, which I think made it very dynamic and very often changing. But yeah, here at this moment, I guess my opponent didn't quite recognize the changing dynamics of the position, where we could be transitioning into a pawn endgame. So after this capture, they thought that knight to e6 check would be devastating. But again, they missed that after king to e3, this pin is not the only part of the position that's relevant, because this pawn is actually promoting. So yeah, just in general, I think kind of a good thing to make sure that you're always cognizant of when the position might be changing. And another thing is try to kind of always keep in mind the ideas that are at play in the position, because when you do that, it's a lot easier to kind of transfer those ideas from move to move and make sure that you're not overlooking different elements of the position that you were considering before. And it also kind of helps you to recognize when the position is actually undergoing change, because you realize concretely in your mind that, oh, this idea that I was considering now, or that I was considering before, doesn't actually work now. So I should be recognizing that now this position isn't quite the same as it was before. And then last thing is, I guess, that when you have a lot of time on a moment that you recognize is probably a key moment, it's good to just slow down and take a breath, take some time to just calculate, because as long as you do your due diligence, you should be able to capitalize on the advantage. And again, it's something that you learn a lot with experience, I would say, because you might not trust yourself in the first few times that you're seeing that a key moment might be available based on the patterns that I've kind of alluded to in this video. You might not be super confident that, hey, yeah, this guy did say that this moment is a key moment, that when the ideas change, this might be a key moment, but I don't feel like I should be spending that much time in this situation because it feels very risky. And that's kind of a balance that you always have to deal with in chess, spending time that you're allotted and doing calculation. But I think that over time, as you keep reminding yourself to take the time to calculate when there's a key moment, you'll kind of begin to realize that, hey, it's actually not that big of an investment, because, okay, yes, it might not end up being correct, that my intuition is actually wrong, and sometimes that happens, but for the most part, you will have decent chances of being correct. And if those chances are correct, or rather, if those chances end up being proven right, you often have very good odds of converting the position from that point on, like 90+% chance. And even if your intuition is wrong, say like 30% of the time, that's still like a 63% added win percentage that you're getting. Plus, even if your intuition's wrong, all you did was spend time. You didn't lose the game from spending that time necessarily. So yeah, hopefully you found this video helpful. If any of you are also struggling a little bit with kind of recognizing when those puzzle-like moments might arise in a game. So yeah, I guess one thing that we can maybe finish off on actually is doing a bit of puzzle rush, where I think we'll do a survival puzzle rush and we'll just go to 30, and I will kind of try to highlight some of the things that I would be looking for in a game that might pop up in my mind, and help me identify that a puzzle is a puzzle. So hopefully you find this helpful, and here we go. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna try and keep my explanations catered to most levels, kind of catered to the level of the puzzle itself. So yeah, in this position, I think I'll try to be cognizant of what a beginner might think in this kind of position, to be kind of explicit. So because intuition at a higher level, it actually isn't much different from the thought process that we have at a lower level as well, I would say, because it simply comes down to, am I seeing an idea or not, and how do I get myself to recognize that an idea is actually present? So it's this kind of situation where this rook has just moved from b8 to b2, and oftentimes you don't fully encapsulate in your mind what's going on. So one thing to kind of recognize here is that the position has changed with this capture. It's rook b8 takes b2. So basically anytime a capture occurs, you should kind of in your mind have this thought process that, hey, the position just changed. My opponent just took a piece of mine, and the dynamics are therefore going to be simplifying and potentially becoming even more chaotic with the concrete variations that are arising. So that's kind of always when you should try to be alert. And in this case, one thing to kind of ask is, hey, what happens with the piece that just captured? And in this case, you have the ability to simply capture it, and there's not really any problems. So yeah, again here, the opponent captured on g4, its pawn, and it's, again, maybe not a moment where the position is fully changed, but it is a moment where you have been setting up this thread, and I think that maybe the key moment isn't really the right term to describe this kind of position, because the idea is simply one that carries over rather than being a new one. But that's just kind of, it's a similar thought process in that regard, maybe, because you are kind of still coming up with new ideas. So like probably a couple moves ago, this idea of setting up a mate threat might have come to mind for the black pieces. And that's probably the moment where it's not a key moment, but it's the moment where a new idea has arisen in your mind. And it's the moment that you might be considering that a key moment could arise. But just having that idea still present in your mind should make you aware of the fact that it's still a mate, because you set up that threat and ultimately white was not able to defend against it. Okay, so here again a capture. So kind of a theme here where opponent captures a piece, and therefore the dynamics of the position change. And again, always good to recognize what happened with the piece that just captured. Well, can we capture it? In this case, yes, we can simply capture like this. Okay, yeah, again, similar ideas. I'll maybe try to go a little bit quicker at this one because I don't want to be revisiting all the same themes. But yeah, the mate was being set up, and at this point, queen to g7 is defended by the knight, and therefore is a mate. Okay, so again here, the capture on f5 changes the dynamics of the position because after this move, we end up with the situation where the back rank is fully opened. So we can simply play rook to b8 check, and rook takes c8. Okay, king to f8, and in this situation, with all these checks going on, it's often very concrete, and when it's concrete, that means the dynamics of the position are very quickly subject to change because tactics are a very fast avenue to changing the position because that's kind of the nature of what they are. They are there to create changes in the position based on the piece dynamics at play. So in this case, with the rook cutting off the king and the queen, with the rook cutting off the king and the queen available to participate in the attack, it's really just a matter of looking for checks, and you might say queen h6, but then the king can run to e8. So instead, the correct move is queen to h8 because the king does not have an escape square and it's simply checkmate. Okay, so here the opponent brings out a queen, and while you might not consider this really a dynamic change in the position, what you should kind of recognize is that typically both sides will be developing in the opening with their minor pieces, their knights and their bishops. And when that kind of principle is broken, that in and of itself actually constitutes a change in the position that you should recognize, that the stasis of development is being broken by the other side, and therefore you should look for concrete opportunities in many cases. Apologies. Yeah, so in this case, we end up getting the situation where the queen moved, and it's actually just subject to being captured by this bishop. Okay, so opponent just captured this knight, and this is an idea that carries over from likely previous moves, but we were setting up this idea of checking and mating on g7. So you spot this key moment by recognizing that that idea was not actually filtered by the black pieces. Okay, here opponent brings the queen to a8, and this is again similar to before where it's not a change in the position that's really doing anything, it's the maintenance of a threat. So this is not necessarily a key moment, but rather just maintaining the ideas that we have in mind and executing them. So their c2 check was a checkmate because the bishop was open. Okay, here opponent captures on e5, and this is again a moment to recognize that here the position has changed because the opponent has engaged in a capture, and in particular the piece placement of the knight has now changed. So this knight on f3, it moves from the square that it was initially on, and that square was doing an important job of defending this h2 pawn. And so queen takes h2 is actually now possible, and it's a checkmate. Okay, so here opponent takes on g5, and now this is more of just a concrete calculation thing, not necessarily a key moment, but in pawn endgames it's important to just be concrete and calculate out the variations, which I guess does kind of constitute a key moment because you have to make sure that you are being accurate, but maybe not the same kind of key moment as the as the ones where you're finding a new idea that you have to execute. Here, it's really just all about making sure that because you have all these new ideas and you recognize that you have all these new ideas, you are adequately considering all of them. So it's not really about identifying that you're in a key moment, because the pawn endgame in of itself is so sharp that you know that it's going to be an important moment to take time and spend calculation on, but rather it's just the process of actually doing that calculation that's important. So here, after king to g5, as white, you should kind of recognize that the main asset that you have here is this d-pawn potentially queening. So the question is, can you clear the path for that d-pawn to queen? And the answer is yes. You can play king to c6, king takes c7, d6, d7, d8, and queen. So the black king isn't actually in time to attack this pawn before white captures this pawn on c7, and therefore this pawn can simply be escorted up the board. And even though the f-pawn is able to move, it was able to get to f2 in the line where it's simply pushed. The queen would simply have been able to retreat back and protect the square on f1, where the pawn would not have been able to make any more progress. Okay, so here, apologies, my computer's maybe lagging a bit. Yeah, so here, this knight on c6 just moved to d4, attacking the queen. And I think that attacks in and of themselves can be constituted as changes in the position, but more important here is that we were already setting up this threat of checkmate on f7, which is one that is carried over from previous moves. So again, when it comes to key moments, it's important just to make sure that you are adequately considering the ideas that are relevant, that have been relevant throughout the past few moves, and making sure that you don't just ignore them, because that's kind of what can lead to oversights. So here, this knight moving doesn't actually address the threat of queen takes f7, which is simply checkmate. Okay, so here, the black rook simply captured on g7, and again here, it's not really about recognizing that it's a key moment, but rather just doing your due diligence and calculating. So those are really the two separate parts of the key moment, where it's firstly about recognizing the key moment and then actually calculating it out. And here, it's simply a matter of recognizing, okay, queen f6 check must be played because it's the only really forcing move here. And now if king to h5, then queen to h6 check is actually checkmate because the white pawn at f3 boxes out the black king. So after queen to f6 check, king h7, queen to h6 check, king to g8, now rook to d8 is simply a checkmate. So queen to f6 check is the correct move. Okay, here is a change in the position where the black pawn has just moved to attack the piece, the bishop on g4. Now, the fact that it's moving to attack the bishop is not actually the important change. The important change here is simply that the pawn has moved and weakened a crucial square, namely the square on g3. So that is kind of an important thing to always have in mind, which is that any pawn move will weaken squares, and that constitutes an important change in the position, whether it's a positional reason or it's a tactical reason. And in this case, it's actually a tactical reason, because not only is the square on g3 just positionally weak, but actually the queen is able to give a check on g3 because of that pawn push. And now, after the check, the king does not have any legal moves. So queen to g3 check is simply checkmate. Okay, here king is in check and it moves. And again, this is more of a, are you carrying over the ideas that were relevant from previous moves? Because this bishop, or actually maybe it's kind of both, because maybe this mating apologies. I think my computer ended up hibernating. I've had some issues with my computer in the past few weeks because it's a bit of an older model now, so it's a Windows, and it sometimes just ends up discharging when it's still at like 12% battery. So it's a little bit frustrating, but hopefully this recording is still being continued. Let me know if you made it to this point in the video and you're enjoying it, but hopefully you can excuse me for that. And yeah, so at this point we have bishop to g4 check, and after the king moves, I guess it's not obvious if the bishop was already kind of controlling this. Probably the bishop was not on this diagonal, this h5 to c1 diagonal. But yeah, with the bishop having moved there, now it's important to kind of consider different ideas that you might have, because it's additionally cutting off this white king from more squares. And namely, the idea that's important to consider is that of checkmate, or maybe more generally that of attacking, but in this particular case, that of checkmate. So the pawn cuts off the f2 and d2 squares, but the bishop now cuts off the e2 square, which creates a checkmate. Okay, king has just moved from a3 to a4. And yeah, this one is really just a pattern recognition one, where it's, do you know your puzzle rush good enough to recognize that when this kind of situation occurs, you've got a conversion on your hands, and it's really as simple as rook a6 check, which is a checkmate. But I think a lot of the time in a game, you might end up just missing this, depending on the level that you're at, where it kind of seems like a nothing move. The black king just moved forward, and it's trying to get closer to supporting the pawn. But whenever you have these kinds of checks available, it's always important to just calculate them out. And I guess when the king is constrained to the back rank, that's kind of the motif that should maybe help you recognize that such checkmates can exist, because the king was already cut off from these two squares, and a rook check would have allowed it to be cut off from all of these squares, so now the king would only have one square available on b2. So when the king moves, it's depriving itself of more squares. So it's kind of the idea of checkmate carrying over from the previous move, but also recognizing that the squares that the white king is able to access have now changed. So rook to a6 check is a checkmate. Okay, so here the queen has moved, and I think the important thing here to recognize is that with the queen moving, it's now not pinning this bishop on e8. And that's kind of the key thing to recognize, because after the queen moves, now we could play something like bishop to c6, but that's actually not the correct move, because it wouldn't be actually a forcing continuation. So there would be queen to d8 check in that position, and the black king would have some problems getting safety. So like queen to e7 check, and the rook on f2 could check on g2, and it would just be overall unpleasant. Probably a checkmating attack that would work out for white, but in this case, the correct way of playing is so we recognize that this is a key moment because this bishop is now, or it's a potential key moment because this bishop is now unpinned, and after calculating the checks and captures and the threats, here the first check that we have is queen to c1 check. We could also play queen to a1 check. Regardless, after king to g2, we almost have this move bishop to c6 check, bishop to c6, if the queen is anywhere, but in particular, it only works if the queen is actually defending the bishop, because otherwise the white queen could simply take it. So we had to have the queen on c1, so that after king to g2 and bishop to c6, the queen is pinned, and the queen on c1 is also defending this bishop on c6. So forcing continuation, and we end up getting its capture and winning the queen. Okay, so bishop takes h3, and again, this is more of a, are you making sure that you're carrying over ideas from previous positions, because here we were setting up this battery, which is eyeing this h6 pawn, and that idea doesn't actually change, so we can simply play queen takes h6 checkmate, and again, just making sure that you are taking a second to just convert the position when you know that it's a key moment that's arisen. So here we go. And here, the queen has moved off of defending this bishop. So again, change into position. And question is, do we have any problems taking this? Answer, not really. We're threatening this mate on h2 next, and white doesn't really have a way of stopping it. They could try to play queen f4, but the queen on h4 could simply capture it. So we would be able to take, and that would be a win. Here, this queen on d7 has now moved to c6, and it's maybe more of a subtle thing that this position has now changed, but it has changed because this queen's position has now changed, and in particular, it's defended by this king. It's defended by the king on b7, and therefore, it's defended by one piece. So we could play something to potentially remove this defender, and that would allow us to win the queen. And that's why the correct move is pawn to a6 check, which is to say that because the king is now lured off the defense, unless the rook takes, in which case we would simply take and we would just win the rook. But if the king had to move, then we would simply take the queen and win the queen. So this ends up winning material. Yeah, here, maybe in a game, what might have been happening was that the king was on b8 and it was on c8, or maybe it was on, sorry, it was probably on a8 and b8, like throughout this duration. So you're probably giving check, or okay, so b8, c8, and probably rook. This left rook was always giving checks, so maybe this was what was always happening. But after the king moves to d8, now you have different mating ideas that could arise, because maybe white was fixated on giving these checks before because they were down just a full queen. But with the king having moved into a more precarious situation where the rooks are cutting off more squares, the position has changed, and therefore it should be an indicator to you to recognize that this is a key moment. And in particular, if you calculate out the checks, simply this left rook to check on d7 would just kind of repeat the position, and you wouldn't really be making progress. But if you check with the f rook f to d7 check, then after king to king to e8, then rook to c8 would simply be a mate. So that's how you can recognize that one. And then here, this is again why pattern recognition is important when you're identifying these key moments, because it seems like nothing has really changed the position. The king has just moved, and that's kind of all that it seems that's happened. But actually, there's more to it, because the king was before on the same file as the rook, so it was in the same line of sight as the rook from this direction. But after the king moves to this point, to d4, it's now um, it's now creating a file that it could be vulnerable on, or rather, it's creating a rank which it could be vulnerable on if this rook on c4 wasn't there. But actually, the rook on c4 being there is not necessarily important, because the king in and of itself, just being on that rank, its presence is all that's necessary to make it potentially a problem on that rank. Because the rook's existence on the c4 square doesn't necessarily mean that it's combating all the problems that the king on d4 could be causing on the rank. And in particular, that should lead you to recognizing that we have a tactic where rook to b4 is now pinning the rook on c4 because the white king has moved. And after the white rook captures, you can simply promote and move the king. So maybe that's a little bit more of a tricky one to spot, but hopefully in a game you can recognize how it would be possible, where it's all about recognizing the small things that might have changed and just kind of building up your pattern recognition to store those kinds of concepts, so that the next time that they appear, you are able to successfully identify them. And in particular, that there's a change in the position. Okay, so here, the black rook has moved from g1 to g3, and I think this is a fairly simple one where it's just attacking our queen, but again, it's important to recognize what's changed in the position, and this black rook's position has changed, and the key thing about it that's changed is that actually it's on square that's defended by our h pawn. So we can simply take it, and we're just up a queen for a rook. Okay, so here, obviously the change is that white has just long castled, and now the question is, what does that mean? Well, this is actually a fairly common tactic in a few openings, where it can be a little bit dangerous to long castle for this reason in some particular circumstances. In general, it's considered slightly more safe on average to, it's considered slightly more safe on average to castle short than castle long. Of course, this is average, so it's in general, but these kinds of tactics can emerge because the white king is a little bit more stranded in the center of the board compared to if it was on g1. So in particular, because there's just been castles, we should be considering the captures and threats. We should be calculating out the position because we believe this is a key moment, because it could be a key moment because of the change in position. And in particular, we have this capture. Rook d takes c3 check. Technically just rook takes c3 check. And this would force b takes c3 because the king wouldn't be able to move. But then we would have bishop to a3 checkmate. So, concrete tactic right there. Okay, and then here we have knight to e3 played. And again, important to recognize what's changed in the position. Well, this knight has just moved to the e3 square. And what does that in particular mean that has really altered the position? It means that we can now move this c pawn and attack the queen. And that kind of constitutes a threat, which we can identify might be relevant for a key moment. And, well, the question is, what happens on c4? Well, we hit the queen, and also because the knight has just moved, we hit the knight on e3. And the queen can still try and defend it by playing queen to c3, but then we can play this move, bishop to b4, and now the knight is double attacked, the queen is attacked, and it's simply collapsing
for white. So we have this move, and we can simply capture. Okay, so here the white rook's position has just changed. Again, that should help you recognize potential key moment where it's changed to a point where this black pawn was defending, rather to a square where the black pawn is defending. So we can simply capture, and we're up a rook. Okay, so here this white rook has just captured, and it's relinquished the back rank defense. And that should kind of clue you in on some potential back rank tactics that might exist, and in particular that we have this move, rook to d1 check. Now rook to d1 check, we have king to c2, queen to d3 mate, but also rook to d1 check if rook to f1, then we could play a few moves. This is where calculation is important if you recognize it's a key moment, but we could play queen to d3 check, and then that would force rook e to c2, where if the king had just moved, then we would simply be able to take the rook and checkmate. So we would have rook to d1 check, rook to c1, queen to d3 check, queen to e2, queen takes, rook takes c1 check, king takes c1, and then I believe bishop to g5 check. And if the rook blocks, then we just take with the queen, and we'll be checkmating next move. And otherwise, the king has to move to b1, queen to d1 check, rook to d1, and queen takes c1 check is a checkmate. So even if it's a little bit hard to visualize, because of the fact that you can recognize it might be a key moment, hopefully you can kind of just work through it in your own mind and process that after these moves, you end up getting a concrete result. Okay, I guess I didn't include f4 because it doesn't actually change anything, but that ends up being the correct way of playing. Okay, so here, again, captures are always important changes in the position to kind of look out for, and in this case, the capture opens up this rook. Can the rook do anything on this file? Well, yes, actually. Even though it looks like it can't, this bishop from Mars is actually supporting the capture on g2. So we can simply play rook takes g2, and if the king moves, at the very least, we can just win the queen, and then defend the promotion. Okay, we have 2 more puzzles to go. So here, it's less about the actual change in the position, but more about recognizing potential avenues of attacking, because you had these ideas probably in play for a while now in the game. Things like queen to e4, bishop takes a3 maybe, like these like kind of just active moves that generally exist in the position. And when these moves exist, you kind of always should be recognizing that it might be a key moment, because your opponent, because you always have these ideas available and you can always kind of experiment with them. That's really what a key moment is all about, is do you have the potential to experiment with ideas? If you do, then you recognize that it might be a key moment. If not, then you simply play it like a regular chess game. Okay, so I think queen e4 is likely the most appealing option for most of us, because it creates a threat on the bishop and it creates a threat of checkmate. But that's not the end of the story, because white can defend both of those threats with one move. And if you want to pause, just take a second to recognize what that move is. That move is bishop to d3. So bishop to d3 protects the pawn and creates an attack on the queen. But here we have a winning move, which is bishop to e3 check. And if the bishop captures, then we simply capture the queen. Otherwise, if the king moves, then we just capture the bishop with the queen, and we end up a piece. So Right? We have check, check, and we end up winning piece. Okay, so last one here. White has just played queen to h5 check. And again, whenever the position is this sharp, you can kind of recognize it might be a key moment. And here we are up a piece at the moment. So it's all about, can we defend this position? And it actually turns out we can, because, well, if we decide to play king to g8, then we would actually have some problems. Or rather, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it's still playable, but it wouldn't actually change the nature of the position, because I think just queen e8 check, and at the very least we're repeating with king h7. So like, white is at the very least just forcing the same position. We have to find something in this situation. Which actually I'm a bit curious to just check afterwards if like there's any like problem. Like, if I'm assuming actually that king to g8 is still a winning move, to be honest. But I think the point that the puzzle wants to show is that we have defensive resource here. Again, concrete calculation, because we know it's a key moment. Queen to h6, and we defend against the queen check, and it looks like we're allowing rook f7, but actually we have bishop to g7, and there's no real threat. There's no rook takes. We can just take back with the king, and the queen is just deprived of the checking squares that it might have because of these pawns on e6 and d5. So we can simply play queen h6, bishop to g7, and we were creating our own threats with queen to d1 check, and just creating a devastating attack against the white king, which is why this position is simply lost for white. And yeah, that'll do it for the puzzles. We can just take a quick look at this one, because I think technically king to g8 is probably still a win. Oh no, it's actually not, I guess, because queen e8... there's rook f7, right. I was thinking that queen to h5 check was forced again, but rook f7 will simply win the queen. Again, apologies for the loud noise there. But yeah, that'll do it for the puzzles today. Hopefully you found this instructive. Let me know if you have any feedback on the content, and otherwise, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe if you do like the content of this channel. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.